Good evening, everyone. We are thrilled to welcome you and excited for you to join us as we kick off our learning leading up to the high holidays this evening. And we're thrilled to have with us, not just tonight, but at Bethel for the high holidays, Rabbi Menachem Creditor as our guest high holiday service leader. We had planned on Rabbi Menachem Creditor playing a very different role this year, as we planned on our high holidays looking very different than it will be. But we know that his presence, even a virtual presence for the holidays, will really add so much kavanah to our experience and will lift us up at a time when we all really need to be lifted up. I have the pleasure of, for the holidays this year, not only sharing the bima with him along with Rabbi Martyr, but I have the pleasure of calling Menachem a friend for quite a long time. We first met, and he was one of my rabbis when I was in college and Menachem was still in rabbinical school. We first met at Camper Ma in Nyack, New York. Rabbi Creditor serves as the Pearl and Ira Meyer Scholar in Residence at UJA Federation in New York. He previously served as a congregational rabbi in Tivot Shalom in Berkeley, California. Before that, as associate rabbi at Temple Israel in Sharon, Massachusetts. He is an activist at heart among the Torah that he teaches. As Rabbi Creditor is the founder of Rabbis Against Gun Violence. And as well, we have spent time together through civil disobedience. We've spent late hours to the evening in a holding cell together when we got arrested in a large rabbinic action protesting hatred and bigotry. Just that's a little bit about who Rabbi Creditor is and the Torah that he will bring. And some of that, I imagine, will be woven into the Torah that he's going to teach with us this evening for the month of Elul to inspire us and prepare our hearts and our souls for this high holiday season. So with that in mind, I turn it over to my friend, my teacher, Menachem Creditor.
Thank you, my rabbi, my friend, Rabbi Olitsky. It is really an honor to be with all of you. There's something extraordinary about this year. I mean, to point to any one of the facets is to miss every other one of the facets. But let's just take stock of the fact that more of us are able to show up on digital platforms than otherwise might have joined together in the preparation for the Chagim. And so given the fact that you are taking the time and we are taking the time and there's a consistent learning series going on for you all during this month of Elul, I consider it a deep privilege to be part of your community's work and your community's heart. I have always appreciated what the high holidays mean, and having ceased my work for now as a pulpit rabbi, to be able to step back into the warmth of a community that lives with each other, that loves each other, that works together to come closer to each other. I've never seen anything like this year. I don't think anyone can remember anything like it. But having visited your beautiful shul building just last week, standing in a sanctuary that holds all those memories, I just began crying. And I shared a Facebook Live video that I think some of you might have seen about what an extraordinary experience it was to go back to shul. So even before we begin tonight's learning, I wanted to express my gratitude to you all for having me. And to daven for the day when we can actually step into a shul together and do a little bit of crying and a whole lot of laughing and davening together. May we be blessed to do that very soon.
Amen. Just one public service announcement before we get started. After Rabbi Creditor is done sharing some text and teaching us, I know that many of you may have questions and thoughts you want to share. You can chat privately Adina Traub, our VP of Programming, our programming guru, in the chat function. Let her know that you want to ask something, and then when that time comes, she will turn it over to you.
Awesome. All right. So I'm in the habit of singing a blessing for learning every time I can, which, there's a tradition you're supposed to say 100 brachot a day, 100 blessings a day. I end up saying one blessing 100 times a day. That's a real blessing for me. So this is a melody that my dear friend, Rabbi David Paskin, wrote for the blessing for learning. It ends with the words la'asok b'divrei Torah. If you've already said the blessing today, that one counted, but you can still sing. And if you don't know it, you're on mute, so sing loud. Here we go. Ya la 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 la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la 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 la, ay ya la la. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Hafokah, hafokah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la la la, ay ya la la la. All right. Now, just a word of introduction in terms of the framing. I'm hopeful that this will be a conversation. Please remember you can chat questions to Adina, and I'm also going to pause intentionally here and there during our learning so that we can hear each other's voices come together as organically as is possible. And I'm going to do some screen sharing as I have some text that will be good launches for our conversation. If you'd like the PDF of all the texts, please just email Rabbi Olitsky and I will get it to him and he can distribute it, make it available to anyone. So here we go, everybody. Before I share a text, I want to tell you a story. One of my greatest joys working as a pulpit rabbi was when someone would come into my office who I didn't know. They would have set up an appointment, scheduled an appointment with someone, and they'd show up and tell me that they were interested in Judaism. And I would always start with this. I'd always start with, you probably think I'm going to send you away 3 times. You've heard that here or there, and God forbid it ever happened to you. But if I were to send you away, I would unintentionally communicate 3 things. One of them is Judaism's not worth it. B, I'm mean. And C, you haven't been thoughtful enough. Are you sure you want this? You can't know that you want this. So what I would always say to them is, I don't think I'm mean. I try not to be. Judaism is awesome. And you're very brave you showed up. You're sharing a vulnerable thing with a rabbi you don't know. And that's a deep honor for me. It reminds me why Judaism is so amazing, why I've dedicated my life to promoting Jewish values as a gift of service into the world. So one person that I was really privileged to work with, his name is Matt, literally 6'10", 6'11", huge, brawny Texas guy. He actually showed up only because his wife, who was born Jewish and was disaffected, she dragged him because she was curious about Judaism again. But he ended up getting more turned on than her. It was fun. There was a lot of work and a lot of fun. Matt came to Rosh Hashanah services one year, and this is why I bring up the story. At the end of Musaf, after all of the davening and all the shofar blowing, he sat through the whole thing. He came up to me. I won't use all of his words because I told you he's from Texas. He has salty language that rabbis don't even know what those words mean. But he looked at me and he was weeping. He said, "Rabbi, it's real. This is real." And I said, I know, but what do you mean, Matt? What do you mean it's real? He said, that horn, it's real. Now, he didn't understand one word of the Hebrew liturgy, but he didn't have to. He understood the depth of the soul that the shofar points to and brings out. It is literally our breath through the most ancient of vessels, pointing to stories we wish never happened, stories we remember explicitly on Rosh Hashanah. He felt it so deeply that all he could do was point to how real it was. And it ended up animating a lot of his Jewish journey, but I never heard shofar the same. And I'd been calling shofar sounds. I was blessed to work with someone who played tuba for the San Francisco Ballet. And this guy, Peter, would end up saying to me, right before he blew shofar, he said, Menachem, fierce, angry, soft, humble, loud. What's the feeling? And because he was so skilled, he could put that emotion into the shofar and not a person missed it. So what I want to do, even though we're going to be looking at texts, is just remember that shofar is real. No matter how you will hear shofar this year, be it on this platform, be it in some strange public space where someone will find a safe way to do something. I have no idea what this world will experience this coming year. But shofar is real. Even the word brings tears to my eyes. Even the word brings me into moments where I would call shofar and see my children and a whole community around, and brings me back to when I was the child and my father would call shofar, and I would just hear that sound. Tekiah Gedola. And the whole world stopped. So the biggest thing I can offer us, even before we look down, and we're about to, but the biggest thing I can offer us is a reminder that it's real. So, I'm going to start sharing a screen, and I just want to point out with so much love, because Joan, I don't know you yet, but either that's Joan or that's Harvey, but you're upside down on my screen. I hope that you're doing okay. Okay, good. Here is the first section of texts that we'll look at, and I can see you all while you're looking at the text. I hope you have a window that opens up for everybody as well. If not, we'll take turns looking at the text and looking at each other. These are selections. This is not meant to be some scholarly, exhaustive study of shofar through text. This is a few, okay? So I love in any normal space to have someone else do some reading. And since there are few enough of us here, maybe I could ask to hear one of your voices. Would someone be willing to read the verse from Leviticus? You just have to remember to unmute yourself and be a vessel for Torah. It's no simple thing, but it's not terribly difficult. Who'd like to try?
Speak to the. Go ahead.
Oh, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, shall be for you a day of rest, a remembrance of the sounding of the shofar, a holy assembly.
All right, thank you, Josh. And it has been a long time since I've heard your voice.
It's been a very long time. You've aged.
Not to waylay our conversation, but you should. I'm sure you are cherished in the way that I remember cherishing you. You were a voice of wisdom and comfort and counsel that I needed really, really, in one moment in particular. So I hold on to that.
Still true. Still true.
I believe that. So when we look at this verse, okay, so first of all, it's Leviticus. These are a lot of rules that surround the priests and holiness and sacrifices. So the command is to speak to the children of Israel in the 7th month. This is about Rosh Hashanah, right? So let's just point out how odd that is. The 7th month, Rosh Hashanah, that's odd. Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. Why is it the 7th month? Just to offer quick answers to questions I'm only asking rhetorically, so no one feels cut off. The Torah's notion of time begins when we begin as a people. Right, the month of Nisan, when we celebrate Pesach, the beginning of peoplehood, that's the beginning of Jewish time. So for the Torah, the calendar begins in the month of Nisan. You count forward 7 months, and then you are in Tishrei, the month that Rosh Hashanah begins, the year begins, At least our calendar year begins with Tishrei. And that's really interesting because when you think about so many Jewish holidays, you know this joke, right? Jewish holidays all have one story. They tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. You can say that about Purim, you can say that about Pesach, you can even say that about Hanukkah, you can say that about so many different holidays, but can you say that about Rosh Hashanah? That's not the story. Rosh Hashanah is not actually a Jewish story. Our high holidays are so odd. Rosh Hashanah is not about the Jews. And Yom Kippur actually is not about the Jews either. Yom Kippur is about individual salvation and atonement. It's gorgeous. It's holy. It is a Jewish frame for doing something existentially human. And the year begins with the birth of the universe. So Rosh Hashanah, in our text on the 7th month, it's going to be a day of rest. It's kind of a Shabbat. The universe re-begins. And a day of Zichron Tru'ah Mikra Kodesh, a day of remembrance of the Tru'ah, the sound of a shofar, Mikra Kodesh, a holy assembly. So if we were to ask one basic question about shofar, just to start our conversation, what is the purpose of shofar? So I'm actually going to intentionally pause. I'd love to hear your voices. You can use the chat function if you'd like. What's the purpose of shofar? Why do we blow it? There is not one answer to this, but why do you think we blow it? So I'll pause. You got to unmute, be brave, and offer a thought. The only criteria is that it has to be real.
I think it's a. Go ahead.
Claire, you go ahead first.
I think it's a wake-up call that the time has come. This is the time when, things will be decided for you for the next year. So start thinking really seriously about how you've been in the past year.
Okay, so Claire, if I could say back what you said with a little bit of an addition, it is a wake-up call to the human world, to the world of humanity. This is when our actions are being evaluated and counted against. So it's a wake-up to people. Okay, thank you for that. Tony, I think you were waiting.
As an adult, I had the opportunity to listen to the shofar being blown with my father, who had not heard it since he was a teenager. And by the time he and I heard it together, he was in his 70s, late 70s. And so listening to his reaction, it felt like it was touching into just a very, almost a very much buried memory for him. And so it brought about, listening to his reaction, it brought about all this remembrance of a feeling for him. And so I always kind of look at it as being called to rise up and to answer that call, to be connected to that call that is an ancient call that connects us from ancient times to now and to move forward.
Beautiful. What I heard you add to what Claire added was a dimension of ancient memory and a story that's bigger than the self, right? It connects me to something that I know from long ago within me and something that is long ago before me. Right? There's something really timeless about the shofar, and we're going to look at a text in a moment that makes that point too. Anyone else want to jump in?
I try and blow. Go ahead.
Want me to go, Sam?
No, this is Sam. I'll be quick. I try and blow the shofar every morning at Minyan, and doing it during the month of Elul. To me, it's just an indication that not a wake-up call so much, but a recognition that we're coming to the end of the year and the beginning of a new year, and everybody should be on guard.
Interesting. I like that. There's a big machloket, a big disagreement in the Gemara about, do you light 8 candles at the beginning of Hanukkah and then count down, or do you light 1 at the beginning and count up? And there's a good functionality to both, right? Knowing that we have less of the time in this year in which to do the work we were called to do this year, right? And the next year's coming, and all of you might join me in saying, thank God, because I am done with this year.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So
This is Fran. Can you hear me?
I can, friend. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
So this year I have a new frame of reference for the shofar blowing, and that is our dear departed John Lewis. And one of the phrases he left us with shortly before his death was good trouble. We have to make good trouble. And I'm thinking of the blowing of the shofar, as Claire said, as a reckoning, as a call to action, to stir up some good trouble. And we all know what we have to do.
Amen. I mean, I even saw a mask that was reminding me what I needed to do. I don't know if Adina has it in hand, but I might encourage everyone just to check out the clarity with which Adina presents herself in the world. Right? There's one central mitzvah I think that everyone is called to do, and it's not only wearing a mask; it's protecting the world by voting. So, moving forward on the text, just a little bit. I don't know if I have the annotating tool available. I don't. So I'm just going to hope that you can see it with me. This text, Rosh Hashanah 16a. And by the way, all these texts are available on sefaria.org if you don't use it for your daily fix of Jewish text, like strange people like me. Now you can. The Jewish Library of Alexandria is available for free because of the wizards, the Jedis, who created this. So there's a wonderful teaching from the Talmud, Masechet Rosh Hashanah, asking the question, Lama tokin bashofar shel ayal, meaning you could blow a sound out of so many different animals. Why is it out of a ram? Why a ram? So the answer here, the Holy Blessed One said, sound a blast before me with a shofar made from a ram's horn, so that I will remember for you the binding of Isaac, son of Abraham, in whose stead a ram was sacrificed, and I will ascribe it to you as if you had bound yourselves before me. Now, we do point to the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, explicitly in our Torah readings on Rosh Hashanah, and it is invoked during the davening, during the prayers themselves. But there is an interesting way, and I say interesting as if this is calm. There's nothing calm about the Akedah. There's an interesting note here, and I'm wondering if any of you picked up on it. It's a strange way that the binding of Isaac is referred to by the Talmud here. It's sort of an unconvincing assumption. Curious if anyone sees something odd about the way the Talmud phrases it here. Here's a clue. I'll highlight it. I can't. It won't let me. It's the last line.
Yeah, I was actually, that kind of struck me too, that I was expecting it to say to be bound to me, but it's before me. And I thought that was kind of odd that we were bounding our own selves before God.
Good. First of all, the spirituality of being bound to God, right? We say that when we put on tefillin in the morning, right? V'rastichli le'olam, I will bind myself to you. I will espouse myself to you forever. It's gorgeous language, deeply devotional. But that's not this. This is binding yourselves. And that's also interesting. Not only before me, it's also as if you had bound yourself. Now, let's remember the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac. Did Isaac bind himself? That's not the story. The command was for Avram to do these actions, and as problematic as it is, and this is a different conversation for us to have, Isaac was the subject, right? It was done to him. Sorry, the object. Things were done to him, as if he were just the ram or the knife or the wood. But rabbis throughout time have believed that because he was old enough to carry the wood on his back, which the Torah said he did, he must have been old enough and strong enough to fight back. He didn't. And because he could have and didn't, it's as if he bound himself. But that's not what the text says. I wonder if we were able to hear Isaac's voice, how he would respond to the Talmud and to God, and to the idea that we should remember his primal pain in our holy moment. We can't imagine what he would say in response to that. But this is an incredible thing because no one, when I said, what does shofar mean? No one said, it's the binding of Isaac and we're re-entering that story. And that's why shofar means so much to me. Maybe it's true that it does that for you, but I gotta tell you, the binding of Isaac is one of those stories that I wish weren't anywhere because it never happened. So why would I use this central symbol and sound and point to the most painful part of Jewish history and textual tradition? So actually, I want to pause there. I want to look each other in the eye as best as we can and actually ask you that question. Why is shofar, right? The Talmud says the shofar needs to be a ram's horn, and the reason it needs to be a ram's horn is because the binding of Isaac. Why? Maybe I'm looking for a good reason. Why should we remember the binding of Isaac as a central motif in Rosh Hashanah at all? If it's about the birth of the world, why that? So I'm going to pause. I'm curious what kind of responses you have. I need some wisdom on this.
I always think of the Dylan song, gonna kill me a kid or something. What is it? I forget what his words are. Gonna kill me a son. And it's just how uncomfortable that's, literally the sound of the story and the sound of the shofar makes me quiver every year. Because the binding, it's just something that I can never read enough about the binding, because it's so inhuman. It makes you think and wrestle and all those things that I guess what they're getting at, that should be this is the time that we should be doing that, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe.
It's evocative of something extremely authentic. And same thing, when I lane, not on the holidays, the Akedat, but when I've lain that during the year, I can rarely get through it without crying, because the language really does take you through the pain. And yeah, so maybe that's it, the authenticity that it evokes.
Yeah.
She's crying, I'm crying. So.
Yeah. I'm not crying, you're crying. Right. My senior sermon at JTS was on the Akedah, and I'm still not done with it. I don't think there's a way to approach that story. There's a new book. Actually, I have it right here. I'm using it for some teaching this year. If anyone's curious, a really interesting book called The Unbinding Isaac, by Aaron Collar. I'll hold it up for a second so you can see. Hopefully it's not backwards. It looks backwards to me. And nothing satisfying about any interpretation of the Akedah. Nothing.
And you said it never happened.
No. Well, I don't know enough about the Torah's history to say what happened or didn't, but what I'm comfortable saying is I wish there were no such story, because nothing happened like that.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, one of the ways to understand the Akedah is in the context of the ancient Near East, where the Torah sprang up and so many other ancient peoples have their central narratives and rituals. The sacrifice of children was very common, actually. And so to understand that the Torah places it in a painful framework is itself revolutionary, even though that's also inadequate. Right? Because what does it say about a God who would command this, even if it were not going to be fulfilled at the end? What does it say about a father who would be willing to do it? And what does it say about a people who invoke the story? I actually think that its raw authenticity, as you all just pointed out, might be the very reason that it's there. There's no escaping it. And in fact, similar to the shofar being so real, the Akedah might be one of the closest things to primal and raw fear and pain, so that when we launch into a new year with all of the pain that we have endured, because every year has a lot, this year has quotients and quantities I can't even point to because it's too hard, but the Akedah is the only text maybe that fits, even though it's so awful. Maybe we need it as an axis mundi, a pole around which our world can rotate, because we can always be pushing against it. I don't want that. We don't sacrifice our children. We don't pursue our truths at the expense of your life. We're not fundamentalists. We won't do that. But in order to say that in a Jewish way, we have to point to where it was done. We have to hear the challenge. And by the way, we just brought John Lewis into our conversation. Just before the pandemic began, I was leading a civil rights mission to Selma and Montgomery. And there's a woman named Joanne Bland. I don't know if anyone has had the privilege of meeting her. And she was 6 years old on Bloody Sunday and was leading us through different mind-blowing moments of her life and of the march and so much. So one of us asked her, there's a lot of talk about renaming the Edmund Pettus Bridge the John Lewis Bridge. How do you feel about that? And she had such an incredible answer, and I think it actually relates in a strange way to the Akedah. She said, I didn't march on the John Lewis Bridge. I marched on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I don't want that to be renamed. How am I going to remember? How are my children and my grandchildren? How are your grandchildren? How is the future going to remember what we had to do to get to a better time if we erase the pain of where we were? Maybe it's essential that the Akedah be here so we can see how far we've come as a people and how far we have yet to go until that story makes literally no sense, until there's nothing to point to in this world that resembles its pain. Maybe that's why it's there. And maybe that's why we blow shofar, because we can't escape the sound. You can't. So much so, I don't know if you know, there's a seminary for the deaf, a Jewish seminary for the deaf in Chicago, where to blow shofar, the mitzvah, right? The blessing that the person blowing shofar says, they don't say, God, you commanded us to blow shofar. It's lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the shofar. But if you're deaf, what does that mean? So the Seminary for the Deaf has a practice that other people I know around the world have started to do. They all hold balloons so that when the shofar is blown, it trembles in your hands. It is real. It's in the air. If your body hears through your hands, right, it can still be real. So I'm going to pause for a second. I saw some people wanted to jump in.
So Rabbi,
Through the text. Go ahead.
Everything that you said really resonates with me, but at the same time, you can't think of the Akedah story without also thinking about how it ended up, right? How it ends.
Good.
It ends with a redemption. And so...
Well, say more about that before you move forward. How is it redemptive?
Well, because in fact, God intervenes and Isaac is spared, right? So there's this incredibly painful moment where God then provides relief. And in that way, and particularly as you begin to approach Yom Kippur, right, that is the meaning of that moment, that you experience incredible pain and incredible heartache and hardship, and yet at the end of it, there is some opportunity, some promise, some hope of God's redemption.
So let me agree with you about some of what you said. I agree that by the end, redemption and a relationship with God, that's the possibilities of that, the promise of that, that's absolutely meant to be present. I'm not sure, well, let me say it this way also. Emmanuel Levinas was a French Jewish philosopher who taught that Torah was holy not because of its origin, but because of its infinite possible meanings. So what I say Torah means is only one possible thing, and what you say Torah means is also just as possible, just as legitimate. So I'm not out to disprove. I'm just sharing the way I see it, which is because at the end of the Akedah, Abraham and Isaac never speak again. And because at the end of the Akedah, God and Abraham never speak again. Redemption for me is a complicated term to place. I actually think that another way of seeing the Akedah and framing it within the spiritual journey we're called to take right now through the month of Elul, where we work on repairing our relationships with each other and with God. One of the other ways to see the Akedah is, what am I willing to lose to be right? And am I willing to be wrong for the sake of healthy relationships in the world? The conversation, the controversies, the politicization in our America right now of wearing a mask as a betrayal of my individual rights is, for me, akin to listening to God telling me to hurt someone else. My truth, I don't want to wear a mask. I don't believe I need to wear a mask. Is different than the responsibility I have to seek out my fellow person's welfare and not see my truth as more important than their life. That leads me in a lot of ways to the activism that I call my rabbinic practice, but also relates to what the Akedah's dangers are. And I'm not suggesting that you and I actually disagree about the dangers of the Akedah. I said to someone a long time ago that the problem with seeing Abraham's actions as righteous and right is that it leads to people flying planes into buildings because they believe they're doing what God says. And so the challenge that I think we face in our world is well framed by the Akedah and how we interpret it. You know, seeing redemption as the possibility of it, I think that's a good way, even if I disagree with its specific read. But seeing the Akedah as the model is very complicated, to say the least. And then the shofar as sort of like a beacon back to the Akedah. Well, really, do I want that? And then the wake up, Claire said the wake up before, for whom? And you're going to see a radical suggestion in a second about the for whom part. I'm paying attention to time, and I want to move us forward through the text a little bit more. But please, I'm just reminding you, if you want to ask a question that I'm not responding to immediately, please let Adina know. And I'll end my sort of the formal, here's the stuff part of this in probably 9 minutes intentionally. And then we'll have a chance to hear each other a little bit more. And then we will hear a whole lot of each other coming up, and I'm looking forward to that quite a lot. So I'm going to share screen again. Hopefully it'll work. Joan and Harvey, I want to give you 100 rabbi points because now you're right side up and I'm not worried anymore. Yashikach. I award, by the way, I broadcast on Facebook Live every morning at 9 o'clock, and I don't know where it started, but I've been giving people rabbi points left and right. And you know what they're good for? I tell my kids this all the time. Rabbi points are amazing. You can trade them in for more rabbi points. That's really all they're good for.
I was going to say, my kids say that they're good for nothing.
Okay. I was looking to you for some response there. See, you just have to convince them that they're good. My kids still haven't gotten me to admit that there isn't a tooth fairy. I'm just telling you, I'm determined. My daughter's leaving for college tomorrow, and she's never heard me say those words. All right. So the text you see in front of you is Rav Sadia Gaon, and he discusses why do we blow the shofar? And he has like a David Letterman top 10 list. We're not going to do all of them, but I'll just skim a few. Right, so this day is the beginning of creation when God created the world and ruled over it. I get it. The inauguration moment for God is the Shochein Ad and the Ha'el, HaMelech. We call God the ruler. On Rosh Hashanah, we replace certain words to establish that throne. And I actually have a friend, a modern Orthodox rabbi in Berkeley, who, if you know Rabbi Yonatan Cohen, he's just one of the sweetest human beings you'll ever meet. He's a Chovevei grad. I used to call him the Jewish leprechaun. He's got this red beard. He's perfect. And he once took his shul to task, saying, not one of you showed up late to the presidential inauguration that year. He said, but you're all late, and you missed Shochein Ad. You missed the inauguration. That's one of the things that shofar is. It's the calling out of the trumpet, because God is here. It's not like God wasn't here before. But it's interesting. We're pointing to God's coronation. Isn't that interesting? Number 2, it's the first of the days of tshuva, the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. So it's the wake-up call we were talking about before. All those who wish to do tshuva, which is another way of saying, all those who wish to survive this year, listen up. Number 3, the shofar at Mount Sinai. One of my favorite sections of Rosh Hashanah is when we do the shofarot, the sections of Musaf, and we talk about the sound of the shofar at Mount Sinai, which interestingly enough, we hear the Torah say that there was a sound of the shofar, but we never hear who blew it. Leaves you to wonder. 4, it reminds us of the prophets, because the sound of the shofar makes you move. And the prophets wanted us not to sit still, not to become so settled in our ways of doing things. 5, it reminds us of the destruction of the Holy Temple. It's painful, isn't it? It's loss. Shofar is all those things. It's real. No real emotion has only joy. That's not real. That's not the depth. Please God, we should have authentic, profound joy. But one of the reasons that it's so real, it's so powerful to feel that joy is because we're real people and we have real experiences, and joy is not everything. 6, the binding of Isaac. 7, when you hear the sound of the shofar, you tremble. That's my friend Matt. This is real. Catch me when we're not recording and broadcasting. I'll tell you what he really said. Told you. Texas language makes everything better. Just not very rabbinic. I mean, Jesse, please. It wouldn't be very rabbinic for me to curse on our first class together. I got to be careful here. Number 8, it reminds us of the ultimate day of judgment. We're told in tradition that the great shofar will sound. Time of assembly, just like the text showed us before. And number 10, the shofar reminds us to believe in the resurrection of the dead. I don't know about that, but isn't that interesting? Maybe. These are Saadia Gaon's 10 reasons. 3 other short texts that point to what the shofar can mean, and share with you something from me, and then open it up to some conversation for a little bit with you. I thought the Akedah was an amazing story in that Abraham was the hero. He and Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik and Soren Kierkegaard called Abraham the lowly man of faith, and his listening to God's literally inhuman command was the suspension of the teleological. So Rambam thinks that the Akedah was a good thing. But look what he says here. The truah that the Torah discusses due to the many years of exile. Isn't that interesting? We don't know what the Torah is talking about. It may be, this is complicated, I'll explain in a second. It may be that the wail that women wail amongst themselves while crying. It used to be in the today. But in the ancient world, women would be hired to wail, to cry and shriek at funerals, to evoke the brokenness of our own hearts. That was a profession. Yilalot. Sigh that one does one after the other whilst they are worried about a great stress. Maybe you and I have been making shofar sounds without knowing it once in a while recently. It may also be both together, the sigh followed by the cry, as it usually comes afterward. Warrior to first sigh and then cry. We therefore do all options. Number 1, that's a really Jewish thing to say, isn't it? Right? I can't figure out, should I cry? Should I sigh? I'm stressed. I'm worried. All right, I'm crying. I'm sighing. I'm both. But maybe that shofar is a sound that defies all language because it's before and after language. There's a wonderful book. I'm in pain, but I can even express a headache with words. It's rawer than words. Last text. This is from Schneerson. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Blowing the shofar is the unique and special mitzvah, which is an integral obligation of Rosh Hashanah. The mitzvah of shofar is not a gathering of multiple musical instruments. Furthermore, it's not a complex instrument that is capable of playing exceptional compositions, unless you're the tuba player for the San Francisco Ballet and you can make a shofar sound like anything. Or Frank London. I don't know if anyone's heard his incredible music with the shofar. The shofar is perforce a simple animal horn, and all sounds are richest, longest Tikya Adolah. It's real because it's a shofar. The shofar emphasizes that our presence of mind must be first and foremost focused on the individual. Our emphasis must be on infusing holiness even into the common parts of our daily life, the community. So the only last thing I'm going to say, I have other texts, but I'm going to leave them behind for now. The only other thing I'm going to say before opening up the conversation so we can hear each other a little bit is that, these days of Elul, we hear shofar every day, or traditionally we do. I've only heard shofar this year so far through a screen. And there's a halachic debate whether or not it counts. And I will tell you this, I was worried that it wasn't going to feel real. That Matt's experience in that sanctuary that day would be so unreachable for me in these days. And then someone blew shofar. And my heart burst open. And I was just sitting where I was sitting, crying. Even the word shofar is doing it to me these days. The idea of shofar. And so what I want to say, not in closing, but just for now, is that focusing on your own heart, the trembling that a shofar is meant to resemble, truah, literally, ri'adah. The kind of wake-up calls I think at least I need. I don't mean to project on you, but it might be true for you. Is that this world is making it laborious to feel. There's so many things happening that it is completely understandable to become a little bit numb. And the shofar doesn't let us do that. Maybe that's also why the Akedah is there. You can't be numb reading the Akedah. So the blessing I would offer us before we talk to each other just for a moment is we should feel fiercely. We should remember, maybe not the resurrection of the dead, as Sadia Gaon points to, but that there will be a better day. And we have to do our work to get there, for certain. But we have to carry that pain with us and let it out in a way that sounds like my sigh, that sounds like crying. I only know the sound of the shofar with my heartbeat again. And so, Claire, you said a wake up, and I said, to whom? Maybe we got to wake God up too. Maybe the shofar points to the Akedah so that God remembers that pain is not the way. Pain leads to distance between people when we exacerbate it and implement it. And the shofar tells me, oh, I remember that story, and I don't want that anymore. I want my heart to beat near someone else's. I want to be close to you, God. I want to be close to you, community. I want to feel redemption. I want to feel hope one more time. So I want to open it up to conversation. I want to begin our conversation with gratitude and just say, again, thank you for inviting me into your community for this year. We flirted with the idea of more than 1 year if things went well. I'd love to be in the same room with all of you someday. It would be so nice. So if you'd like to jump in, please unmute yourselves. I'd love to hear your voices and your thoughts.
Malcolm, will you just end your screen share so we can see each other's faces?
Oh yeah, everybody. Now we can see each other. Go ahead.
Rabbi Menachem, I really loved when you said, talking about it's time to improve, given how tough this past year was, it's a good challenge. But I just thought that the Hebrew root is shipur, right? Shin pereh, shipur's improvement. Lishtaper, to make yourself better, in a way.
So let me honor your comment by calling you the Hasidic Rebbe. You clearly are. Hasidic Rebbeim were known for replacing letters, right? Not being as specific. So lishtaper is to improve, to break. And let's combine both beautiful ideas. Right? In order to be part of improving this world, we have to enter into the brokenness and not deny it. Face it head on, tremble, and then be where we were.
Amen, amen.
Love that. Thank you, Josh. Mindy.
Yeah. Can we go back to the Akedah, or are we?
I would like to say we never have to go back,
Okay.
but I think this world requires that we don't leave.
Well, I've always been mystified by the line, the pasuk in 27 about Ki avimi azabuni, that my parents abandoned me. And at some point I connected that, or I saw a connection with that, between that. It's not a happy family. And sometimes we don't get to talk about that. But I don't think 100% of the families sitting in the sanctuary on joy that they experience totally in their family. And I just saw the connection there.
Yeah, I appreciate the raw reflection that means. I once gave a talk. Rabbis always have to figure out this balancing act, like how much of our inner life do we share in public? So I would always talk about how the struggle in the Torah readings we chose, the rabbis chose for Rosh Hashanah and the Haftorah, point to infertility and the struggle to have children and the hope, and that my children's mother and I went through a lot of work to try to have our children. And I thought that in sharing that pain, it could be a compassionate experience. And then someone came forward and said to me, Rabbi, thank you for sharing the way that you did, but I've tried too, and I don't have children. So you're talking about a story that ended well for you, but I don't have that story. And so over and over, I think when we truly grow together as a community, we recognize that we hold such a diversity of experience that one understanding of Torah, even one understanding of pain, is inadequate. And so not only do I honor the way that you are facing the text and connecting it to a very painful chapter of Psalms, right? My parents abandoned me. I mean, if that's Isaac's voice, boy, does that make a lot of sense. If it's Sarah's voice too, but was abandoned by the story. It's only by midrashic, bravery, courage, and ongoing creativity that we bring Sarah into the story at all. She's ignored. And so all I want to say to you is I totally hear you, and I don't wish any facet of any of the story's pain on anyone. But because we're real, it feels way too real for too many of us. Sam.
Claire Nuremberg and I were her family was a member, and my wife and I were members of Temple B'nai Abraham in Newark for many years, where Joachim Prince was the rabbi, and every second day Rosh Hashanah, he would deliver a up-to-date sermon on the Akedah. And he would take the story of the Akedah, relate it to what was going on, like children and this Vietnam War, and how can you have a father? What would a child today do if his father was carrying him up the mountain? You know, it would not be a child of the '60s, certainly, and so on. And he would relate it. And that story, I try and think of it in a more modern fix. And I haven't got to it this year, but I mean, it's the kind of thing that I think would probably be more meaningful, as important as that story is, and to make it more believable in terms of relating it to something that you know, a relationship of father and his child today. So I don't know whether that brings anything to the party or not, but I want to tell that story.
First of all, thank you for sharing that. I believe that brings a lot to the table. One of my favorite verses in the entire Tanakh is for Shabbat Hagadol, the Shabbat before Pesach. The Haftorah comes from the book of Malachi, and the verse that describes when that joyful, you know, end of days day is announced. The verse says, "V'heshiv levavot al banim v'lev banim al avotam." You will know that Mashiach is here because the hearts of parents turn back to their children and the hearts of children turn back to their parents. I've always found that even when my understanding of the Akedah changes and the different format of it changes, that verse is the ultimate rejection of what the Akedah threatens. That the world will only be whole when we cannot allow the Akedah to be manifest in any way in our world. I could point, and I'm sure you can too, to countless examples. I'll just use America, as if that's, you know, the willingness of politicians to sacrifice their children for NRA dollars. The willingness of people to endanger teachers without the proper protocols so that they can implement education safely. The willingness to sacrifice the future and degrade the environment. That is all the Akedah story. Go to war and kill someone else's child. It's not to say that we have to agree about every dimension of politics, but it is clear, unfortunately, that the Torah remains relevant. And the Akedah as a story is a frame that can still be placed.
Thank you. That was good.
So, I hear you. Let's take maybe one more question or comment if there is one. I'll pause for a second to see if there is, and then I'll continue that. Well, here's what I'd like to do. One of the ways that that Rabbi O and I shared that really important night when we got arrested is we were sitting in a holding cell singing. We were singing all night. It was this incredible thing that I looked out of the cell that we were in, and our taluses that we'd been wearing were all hung up on little hooks while we were just singing. The police, I don't imagine, have ever had that experience before or since. But for me, one of the ways that I express my soul, and I'll be glad for us to share together, is through music. So I thought I'd close us with a little ego. You want to sing with me? No? All right. It's almost tuned, but it's through Zoom. You'll never know. This is by Rabbi David Zeller. It's one of my favorites. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Look forward to sharing the Chagim with you really, really soon, and a very, very early Shana Tova.